All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our third video in our series about equity and efficiency. So far, we have looked at the difference between income and wealth, and we've looked at the difference between absolute and relative poverty, as well as the Henderson poverty line. Today, we're going to be looking at some measures of income distribution, looking at income quintiles and how they made up, the differences between them, and what that means overall. And so we're going to look towards the end of this, we're going to look at Lorenz curves and what that means, how we use that to get a Gini coefficient, which tells us the overall level of inequality that exists in Australia. All right, so today we're mainly going to be talking about measures of income inequality and poverty, such as Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient, as well as the overall income quintiles that exist. Then a little bit later on, you're going to probably, well, if you're in my class, you're going to do a research task into the difference between poverty in Australia and one other nation, but that will be a future problem for you. So, some ways we use to measure income inequality. So we can look at gross household income, which is the total income from all sources before income taxes have been deducted, household disposable income, which is household income minus personal income taxes, or equivalized household income, which we talked about a little bit before, which is when the ABS adjusts household disposable income to take into account the number of people in the household that is relying on that income. It's obviously different. A single income household is very different to a double income household or a household that has 13 kids. The money is going to have to be spread much further. So the ABS uses equivalized household income to place them in a ranking from lowest to highest in 5 groups, which we call quintiles. So basically the lowest quintile is the lowest 20% of the incomes that exist. Then we've got the next 20, the next 20, and then the highest, the richest 20% of income overall. So another way of presenting the same information converts the weekly income amounts into a share of the total of all mean household incomes. So for example, the lowest quintile, so the lowest 20% of people only earn 4% of total income in Australia, whereas the highest quintile, so the top 20%, earn 48% of all income. So it's a pretty significant difference. The rich are earning a whole lot of overall income, whereas the poor are only earning a tiny fraction of that overall. So in Australia, the distribution pattern is uneven because people receive vastly different percentage shares of total national income depending on their skills, their what they do realistically. So how incomes are determined tends to be on either the skills required or the supply and demand of that particular position. But despite this, the inequality would be a lot greater if the Australian government did not attempt to reduce the level of inequality and try to ensure that everyone has access to basic goods and services. So they do this through welfare, they do this through public education, they do this through the fact that we have public healthcare. So you can go to the hospital, if you break your arm, you're going to go to the hospital in Australia, they're going to put it in a cast, they're going to do all your x-rays and all those kind of things. They'll do surgery if you need surgery. You will come home, you will not pay a single cent. Whereas you could go to, say, for example, well, you can't go right now, but if you went to Thailand and you broke your arm, you would get an itemized list of every expense the hospital used while you were in their care that you will have to pay for. There are examples in America where people will break a bone or they'll have a sickness and they won't go to get help for it because they can't afford the help. So we're very lucky in Australia that we avoid some of this inequality because we can get healthcare if we need it. So in order to clearly show the actual pattern of the distribution of equivalized household income, the ABS often separates members of the population into 5 quintiles that we talked about before. So each quintile represents 20% of all income earners. So quintile 1 is the poorest 20%. Why this is important is it's going to come into play later on when we look at the Gini coefficient and how we get the Lorenz curve, which all these words are meaningless to you right now, but they will mean something later. So when we look at Australia at the moment, this is stats from 2019, I believe. I tried to get updated ones yesterday when I was making this. But if you look at the lowest quintile, their average household income is only $24,000. If you think about that, that's pretty significantly low. So for example, when I was a uni student and I was just working in a bottle shop, I made about that in a year just from working part-time. So the lowest quintile is not getting a significant amount overall, and their wealth is only about $35,200. So that's really low. Like, they don't own much either. They've only got about $10,000 of assets, which is pretty scary. and they only have 1% of national private wealth. Then we move up, so the second quintile earns about $53,000 per year, the third quintile $88,000, the fourth quintile $135,000 as their average household income, and the highest quintile on average earn $280,000 per year as their household equivalized income. And then they have about $3.2 million of wealth. So you can see why there is a big divide here, because they can use that wealth to make even more income. And they make 48% of all income in Australia and have 63% of all wealth. So it's really not shared evenly, which is a bit of a worry, but that's pretty significant. Most people kind of fall into this third quintile of around 88,000 per year and having about just over $500,000 in assets. These tend to be people that definitely aren't living in poverty, they're middle class. But that tends to be the overall average. So the National Australian Household Net Wealth is just over $1 million is the average for households to be worth. So that includes like all your assets, your income, etc., or like your overall, every bit of asset that you have works itself out into that number. So these are some other stats. Like obviously this is just a lot more information. You don't need anything specifically from it. Mainly put it in here because I wanted to highlight the difference between what people earned on average in basically in the last 10 years, so how that has changed. So to just highlight one thing quickly, so the mean grossly weekly income in 2007-2008 was $2,061, whereas now it has gone up to $2,242, which is about an 8.8% increase in income over time. But if you looked at the overall like rates of inflation, etc., that's probably fairly in line with inflation. Therefore, people aren't actually earning much more. If not, it's really flattened out a lot in general. All right, so, and then we've got what's going to become important later on is we've got the Gini coefficient here, which is the amount of inequality that exists. And we'll get onto it in slides after this one, but essentially the closer you are to 0 means that there is higher equality, and the closer you are to 1 means there is total inequality. So you'll see that in 2007-2008 it was 0.336 and now it's 0.328, which although that's not that significant of a change, it means that things have actually gotten a little bit more equal over time. Although we're a little bit lower, and there's a little bit more inequality than there was in 2015-2016, but things are getting slightly more equal in Australia. So, and that helps explain this. So we've got what's called a Lorenz curve, and you'll need to be able to understand what these mean, but all the amounts of what households earn in each quintile are then put together into this graph called the Lorenz curve. And so you'll see on the axis here, we've got the cumulative share of wealth or income. So that's basically adding it all up. If you put all of it together, you'll eventually get to 100% at the top here. And then we've got the cumulative share of households. So 20% of households, if we looked at here. So we've got, if things were equal, 20% of households would earn 20% of wealth. But what actually happens is that 20% of households have way less income and way less wealth. And as we go along, it slowly goes up. And so the bigger the gap between these two curves are, so you can see with wealth, it's quite significant. So wealth, it takes up this whole space here, or with income, it takes up this smaller space here. The bigger that gap between where the Lorenz curve is and the equal distribution, the more inequality that exists. So one of the things the government is trying to pursue by pursuing equity are bringing those curves closer together to minimize inequalities. They're never going to be totally together, like the Lorenz, or like the Gini coefficient that you get from measuring this is never going to be 1 in Australia, but we want it to be not 0. We don't want total inequality. Like if things were totally total inequality, it would basically just be all the way down here, which would not be great. So finally, the ABS publishes a general indicator of the pattern of income distribution called the Gini coefficient, which is basically a number between 0 and 1 that highlights how much inequality exists in Australia. So the Gini coefficient is a measure of the degree of inequality in the distribution of a nation's income or wealth. And on the Lorenz diagram, the area between the diagonal line and the internal equality and the actual nation's Lorenz curve. So you'd have seen that for the green line was total equality, the pink curve was income. The gap between them represents the inequality that exists, because if there was no inequality, they would be touching, they'd be together. But the further they are apart, the more inequality there is. So the Gini coefficient is a number between 0, which is total equality, and 1, which is total inequality. The ABS also does this for various other things. So they look at the difference between incomes in males and females, between states and occupations, to get all different kind of figures about how income is distributed in Australia. So if you did it between males and females, you'd see that on average, males earn more than females in Australia. Still, there's still an income gap and there's still inequality there, even if males and females are working in the same roles, which is interesting to look at. In different states, on average, incomes across the east coast of Australia are higher, although in Western Australia they're fairly high because of the mining industry, whereas in Tasmania they could be a little bit lower. And then if we just look at how income and wealth is spread across generations, this is not actually that important. I just thought it was interesting when I found the image yesterday. You can see that what we've got here is the average household income per generation. So you'd see that younger boomers are earning the most overall, whereas older generations are earning less, and Generation Y is earning a bit less than Generation X. And you'll also see, though, the distribution of wealth is quite significantly different. So as you go down and get to the younger generations, the wealth is lower. Obviously, part of that is going to be they haven't had as much time to accumulate that wealth, but it's also much harder to attain now. And the older generations are able to accumulate more and more wealth based on the value of their current wealth. All right, that's it for today. I hope that you've gotten something out of this. You've understood that with the Gini coefficient, a number closer to 0 is total equality, and the closer it is to 1 is where there is total inequality. So the larger that number gets, the closer you are to total inequality. The Lorenz curve being that diagram with the straight diagonal line and the curve that shows you the overall amount of inequality, as well as looking at different ways that income can be distributed. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave me a comment below, shoot me an email. My email is in the description below this. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll be back next time to start talking about some of the ways in which we try and achieve efficiency, I believe. Have a great day. See you later. Bye.